is such a thing in relativity as time dilation, where different observers measured time differently if they're moving at different speeds. He says the guy who wrote the first book of Genesis, Genesis 1, was moving at a speed with the expansion of the universe, which is close to the speed of light. And in his perception, 7.5 billion years took one day.
Welcome to the Gary Scott Thomas Show. Here's what we know. The podcast with unexpected conversations. Listen each week as we engage in unscripted conversations where we'll be just as surprised as you will be with where the dialogue goes. So join us each week and be privy to the captivating conversations that are sure to ensue. Here's your host, Gary Scott Thomas.
So I could spend the next 45 minutes just giving you his resume. To say that it's impressive is a little underestimating the whole thing. A 45-year career, vice president of the Science and Environmental Policy Project, written books on papers that touch on the high temperatures and superconductivity, the rocket reentry instrumentation, measurement economics, and the list goes on. And he's got a PhD from MIT. But I'm excited about his new book, Everywhen, God, Symmetry, and Time, Dr. Thomas Sheahen. Dr. Sheahen, how are you?
Just fine. I'm glad to talk with you.
I'm thrilled to talk with you because I would tell you, I am a man of faith. Always have been. And I'm always surprised when I hear people try to say that their atheism or their removing themselves from the world of faith started with science. Because I will be honest with you, as I have become more and more fascinated with science, and I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but I've become fascinated with astrophysics and physics. And the more I study, the more I learn, the more I find my faith and find it harder and harder to think that we're all just a computer simulation.
Absolutely true. You're absolutely right in that regard. The appearance or the publicity surrounding the idea that scientists are atheists is really mistaken and very misleading. Everyone who really looks carefully into science at a very high level finds that the upper reaches of research and so forth, the pointers are there pointing again and again and again to the fact that God created science. He invented it. He thought it up. And it is his accomplishment that we, as scientists, are studying. And this is something that I think has escaped the attention of the general public because of the way media and publicity works.
Yeah, I agree because we like to think that we're in control of everything. I think that's the hubris of mankind, right? And whether it's global warming, and we can talk about climate change, we can talk about all because you're very versed in that also. I've been enjoying my research into you because you're a fascinating fellow. You really are. And
thank you.
Well, it is. And as I go in with this, we just have a hard time thinking there's something more than us. And I think that's what science does, because I don't think man's brain can comprehend the scope of the numbers. And you talk about that, but we can't really envision the scope of what it is to get to Jupiter, much less numbers larger than that.
Exactly true. Yeah. The comprehension of really big numbers boggles the mind, as well it should, because they are big numbers. And people will have ideas oftentimes gotten from television or maybe science fiction or something like that, where they think that things that can be sketched out and written about are in fact real, where real things, as in going to Jupiter, have to do with engineering and machinery and accomplishments that are well beyond our scope today. And an awful lot of science is very similar in that we think we've accomplished something wonderful, and we have made real accomplishments. Look at medical science, for example. It has been wonderful. But we do not appreciate what a huge gulf there is between what we can do and what God has already done in creating nature.
You know what I find funny when I was growing up, and again, I was a child of the 60s, that science news came out so infrequently, right? And then when it came out as, and this is the definition of what all there is and there all will be. And now, because I've been doing a radio show for years, I literally do a weekly bit on new science news. And usually it all comes with a caveat of, here's what we found out, and for as much as we know, this is what we think today. Which has just been a diametric, it seems to be a seismic shift in how they present information.
Well, your last phrase is exactly the right way to present it. This is what we know, this is what we think today, but we underline today because it could change tomorrow, because any scientific theory is always subject to revision. There's no such thing as final when you're talking about science.
Well, you're old enough. You remember when they came out with the steady state theory of the universe, and they thought that's it. There can't be anything else. And
that's right.
The hubris that came along with that, and now today, and like I said, that's where I find my faith. The fact that even now, it was just what was it? Somebody they can't understand why some planets are formed that they shouldn't be there. Planets that are, what is it, 3-4 times the size, or maybe it's 10 times the size of Jupiter, and we didn't even think those planets could form. And now we just kind of go, yeah, well, we don't know.
That's right. Yeah, this is exploration of science. It just turns over surprises every time, every single day, every month, every year. There's some new surprise coming along. And it shows that the fact is that science is incomplete, and it's always a progress moving forward. And that's a big difference from what is represented by your people who get too much TV time. There's a famous atheist named Dawkins over in England who has been very belligerent and loud on television, and he just doesn't understand the real reality of science. The man's an excellent biologist, no doubt about it, but the grandeur of science, the scope, the exploration, the cosmology, and all that are something completely different and greater and beyond anything you've heard from these television people.
Well, even Dawkins says there is a mystery that can't be explained when it comes to consciousness. He's like, there's no reason why we should be conscious and be able to contemplate it, because biologically it kind of serves, and these are me paraphrasing his words, it doesn't really serve a purpose. You know, giraffes are able to exist without contemplating, you know, measurements of time and space.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. No, this is a very good point. And the fact that there is in human beings this consciousness, a reason, a will, all these abilities of the soul have really escaped the attention of people who strictly attend only to naturalism, to materialism, to wanting it to be part of atoms and molecules. They go looking and they don't find it there. And the reason is because the consciousness, the higher functions of mankind are beyond the level of just material things alone. And that's kind of dawning on folks after an awful lot of time spent looking in the wrong corridors.
That's crazy. Well, when you sit back and think about the whole concept of, again, the reasoning behind it, and why would we be able to contemplate God? Why would we be able to contemplate our place in the universe and the construction of things? You want to get down to quantum physics. Why would we even what is the purpose of having that ability?
Well, if you're looking at the comparative advantage of foraging for food, your saber-toothed tigers have got us beat completely, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, if you say there's greater things to life, then you start to move in the direction of greater consciousness, greater thinking, and so forth. My own belief, and I have to say, underline the word belief because I can't prove it,
mm-hmm.
is that in setting out to create, God wanted to create a creature that was capable of loving him in return. God loves his creation, and he wanted to have a creature come along someday that would be able to return that love to God. Now, the someday turns out to be 13.8 billion years, and that bothers a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because they say, oh, why couldn't God do it quicker? Well, the emphasis in my book, the reason the title is Everywhen, is that God is present to all time And he doesn't have to look at his watch. He doesn't have to wait as we humans do as time goes by. He doesn't have to look over centuries and millennia and epochs and so forth of grand scopes of time as the stars evolved and did all this stuff. He is present to time. And in his creation, he has found human beings are indeed capable of consciousness, of understanding, of thought, of will, and of love. And to direct that love back to God is the intention of creation. But when we look at it with our time scale, we are just absolutely awestruck by it. And what I'm preaching here with this book of Everywhen is be humble. Be appreciative of the fact that God is smarter than us, and he is better than us, and he can do things that we can't even comprehend.
We can't think of anything he hasn't already thought of. And I love the idea how because I've got a 10 and a 12-year-old, and trying to explain to them the concept of time and going, listen, time only exists in our minds. Time doesn't exist. The universe doesn't have a clock. And I've said this thing to him before, that God doesn't exist inside of time. I will sometimes pray. My parents and a brother passed away years ago. I will sometimes pray, Lord, can you give them peace at their moment of passing? Because I know, unlike me, he's not locked in to the time frame that I'm in.
That is exactly true. You can be praying for something today, and God can answer the prayer 100 years ago. That's what happens when you've got comprehension of total time of everything. And we humans don't have that. You say, what do you mean you're praying for something that happened in the past? That's crazy. No, it isn't. Because when God hears a prayer, he can take the action at the appropriate time. He can have conceived a child in 1960 who turns out to be a medical wizard and a genius and can do that delicate heart operation. He can do all kinds of things that we are stunned by. We're mystified by it. But that's the difference between us and God. And if we are puzzled by it, that's our problem, not his. That's a really important part of humility that human beings really need to keep in mind.
Well, I love your statement that time is the falsest god of all.
That's right. Because people, when they think that God is limited in time, when God is subordinate to time, then they have placed a false god before God, which is forbidden by the commandments, right? Mm-hmm. First thing he said to Moses. All right. If you can say that God is superior to time, that God is the creator of time, then you will no longer make him subordinate to time. And then you have risen above that, having that false god blocking the way. That's what a false god does, is it gets in the way of reaching the true God.
In the books of Genesis, and I'd love to go and get all your thoughts on this, because I said, I'm captivated by this. Like when I talk to my kids, because like I said, we're a faithful family. And when they're like, so one day God created this in one day and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, again, to me, when I read things like that, if I went back in time 700 years ago and tried to explain television to someone 700 years ago, none of the terms I would use would mean anything to them. It would end up me saying it's a magic box that comes to life and shows you things, because there's nothing else they could wrap their head around. And so when the Bible came along, again, this is my conjecture, that God used language that men of that time could understand. But my thing, the way I read it is, I have no idea what a day is in God's life, because his time frame is not mine. What's your thoughts?
Absolutely true. I agree with you 100%. And that is the cornerstone of understanding our translations of the Bible. What do you like? English, French, Chinese, anything you want. The guys who had the job of writing it down in the first place had two problems. One, what could they comprehend from what God was trying to tell them? And two, what could they write down that people could understand? And on television, a couple of times I've heard Father Spitzer speak about the origin of the universe and all that. And he rattles off the whole thing about quarks and so forth, and neutrons and protons and particles, and it's entertaining. But when it gets done, he's saying, now, would that be what we ought to put in the book of Genesis? And the answer is obviously no, because that doesn't communicate to the people who are trying to learn from it. The idea of the length of the day is one that people have fought over and struggled over for a long time. And here again, this is a matter of how you interpret time and everything. There is a Jewish scholar named Gerald Schroeder over in Israel, who was an American-born person who went to MIT, like myself earlier, though, got a PhD in physics, so forth, and went over to Israel and became a professor there. And he has a very interesting combination of thinking. He thinks his religion is true and his physics is true. And he looks at this idea of the length of time in the Bible and the length of time in physics and so forth. And he says they must both be true. So he said, how can they both be true? And his answer was very, very smart. He said, there is such a thing in relativity as time dilation, where different observers measured time differently if they're moving at different speeds. And he says the guy who wrote the first book of Genesis, Genesis 1, was moving at a speed with the expansion of the universe, which is close to the speed of light. And in his perception, 7.5 billion years took 1 day. And the next 3 3/4 took 1 day. And the next 1.5 took 1 day. And he gets the whole 13.8 billion years into 7 days. It's a brilliant stroke of genius on his part, and it was motivated by the fact that he insisted and imposed upon himself the requirement that both his religion and his science had to be right. So I admire that particular way of thinking. And I think he really accomplished something there. But nobody understands it because all the people who insist on six-day creationism, they don't understand relativity. They've got no concept of time dilation or different time frames. And it's a real shame that that very brilliant idea of his has escaped the attention of so many people.
Well, and time is so, and again, the book is very, very interesting. Again, Everywhen, God, Symmetry, and Time, and talking about time, because as you said, time is relative. If you're on a spaceship, time is moving slower for you than it is for those of us down here. Even if you're just an orb around the Earth, it may be only thousandths or millionths of a second, but the farther you get out from it, I mean, they have to calculate that on all the GPS satellites, because the time is moving differently than it is here on Earth.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a very important point. And we can see it in something practical that we know of today, as in GPS satellites. And we can believe in the theory of relativity that what we can find and measure as relevant for GPS is equally accurate as a theory that will affect space travel to planets and galaxies and things like that. So it is a gift from God that has given us the understanding, the ability to understand things like relativity, and thereby project calculations that go out to huge distances over space.
Can I ask you a complete nerd question?
Of course.
Not many times do you get to talk to MIT doctorates, who've got a resume like yours. What do you make of the Pentagon pictures and tapes of the UFOs? They don't call them UFOs anymore, right? They call them ABs or UAPs or something like that, or PAUs.
Yeah.
You've seen those, haven't you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. There are weirdities out there that are sometimes just optical illusions caused by refraction of light coming through the air. There are signals coming around here and there. There's a lot of unusual stuff that is beyond understanding. And somewhere in there may in fact be something real. But the elusiveness of it is very, very difficult to overcome. And I think that our chasing of UFOs at this time is probably going to be futile. I don't know if you remember a movie called Cocoon. About 30 years or so, a bunch of aliens came to the Earth and were looking around for some of their buddies who were buried in a swamp in Florida. And an Earthling discovered that they were aliens, but they were well disguised. And the boss of the operation from the faraway Antares says to the Earthling, well, you can report us to the authority, but if you do, all that'll happen is we'll just rent somebody else's boat. In other words, our disguise is so good that you can't figure us out. And I think that if people came on a UFO of some sort, I shouldn't say people came, aliens came, they would have a real good disguise. And if we, as planetary people, travelers ourselves, ever get so good enough to actually show up at some other civilization, by that time we'll have gotten really, really good at disguising. And therefore, we won't get detected.
My thing is, I don't think, first of all, as we talked about earlier with the distances, I don't think we can comprehend the distances that are involved. Even the average mind, and I include mine, can't comprehend the distance of the solar system, not the galaxy, but the solar system, and how long it would take. I wonder if, you know, how do you think that those spatial realities can be breached? And how long would it take to do that? Because, I mean, scientific minds have been around, you know, we can limit it to the last 150 years as far as us seeing the technology that we're seeing now. How long would it take to get to that level where you could go literally 2,500 light years, which sounds small, but is amazingly large distances?
Yeah, this is a very important point that people just don't realize. Science fiction and the TV shows and so forth. Star Trek was a wonderful TV series, and it really was. But the space travel and so forth is fascinating from a science fiction point of view. But from the point of view of an engineering device that actually moves and scares people, getting to the moon was quite an accomplishment. We haven't gotten much further. Will we get to Mars in a few years, in a few decades, in a century? Well, I hope so. But will we escape the solar system? Aside from laughing and saying not in my lifetime, I think that times of the order of 1,000 years might be necessary for us to do that. And en route to that, we've got to gain an understanding of just how gigantic those distances are and how difficult it is to cover them. So most of what we're going to be doing in space exploration, I think, for the very long foreseeable future, as in centuries, is going to be done by robots. And we've got some pretty good robots on Earth already. If you've seen an automobile manufactured lately, you'll see the robots are awfully good. But artificial intelligence and machine learning and so forth are all technologies that we're getting better at. And I think our space exploration is going to be done with robots for many, many years to come.
I think it would have to be. I mean, and I'm surprised and shocked and yet not when you use the thousands of years. When you think about how much technology has changed in 10 years, in the last 10 years is remarkable. And to think about, there's really not much you can tell people, hey, in 10 years, you're going to have a robot that has a face and can talk to you. That wouldn't shock anybody. Where 30 years ago it would have, right? But now you can say that, yeah. You can say, oh, well, you can just throw anything out. I mean, it didn't matter. Just throw anything out. And now we're so ingrained with, well, anything's possible scientifically that we go, oh yeah, I could see that happening. The fact that you use the term 1,000 years to be able to get through some of these technological barriers when it comes to the distance of space is fascinating.
Well, okay, now let's be careful about this because I am talking as a human being of the 20th and 21st century.
Yeah.
Okay? And my perception is limited. Those who are thinking well ahead and doing the stuff that is making our robots better and better may be finding a way to project images, holograms, and things like that to far distant places. And you remember the Beam Me Up Scotty stuff?
Yeah.
That had to do with holograms and that kind of thing. Maybe projecting a hologram out to, pick one, Neptune or Saturn or someplace will be possible, okay? For reasons that I am not good enough to say now. But if so, then it'll be possible to get information back from there at speed of light type speeds because light is projected at the speed of light. And so a signal going out to Neptune and back will only take a matter of an hour or something like that. Right now, sunlight takes 8 minutes, I think, or is it 8 seconds to get to the Earth? No, it's 8 minutes, I think. Anyway, I have to work on that a little mind fuzziness there. But to be able to project a hologram way out to a distant planet may be technologically possible within the present century that we're in. And if I don't know how to do it, that's not a problem. But there will be smarter guys than me who will come along, and they will do smart things. And I wish them well. But I have to, again, underline my own limitations, that I see things through the eyes of a person from the 20th or 21st century, and that's limited. So there's a big difference between my science and the science of the future.
You see why I love talking to smart people? Smart people just tickle my fancy. And the idea that we would be able to send holographic drones. I mean, I haven't even thought about that. You just kind of blew my mind. Which you could send a drone to Neptune. Let's just call it Neptune, because Neptune is billions and billions of miles away. So you could send it to Neptune and have that drone study the winds and the color of Neptune and why it's there, because we really don't know a lot about Neptune and Uranus. They've not been enough interesting things about them to make us go. Pluto was much more interesting than the two gas giants, even though now it seems that science is getting really interested because we can't really figure out why they're there, huh?
Well, the thing about Neptune that's interesting is one of its moons. We sent a probe out there, and they landed a small little parachute not quite a parachute, a device came down. It was called the Huygens satellite, Huygens, after a 17th century astronomer. And that decoupled from the main craft and then descended into the atmosphere of the moon Titan. And that was a great accomplishment, too. And we learned something about that moon, which is more interesting for our purposes than the planet itself. This is the kind of thing where people are going to be thinking ahead and doing these things. We know that Jupiter has got at least 11 moons, I think, and some of them appear to be just sort of hard rocks and not doing anything. But is there something there that might be useful? We have to get a lot closer to find out before we can understand it. But that'll happen. There will be explorations of this type that I think may be able to take place in less than 1,000 years I mentioned some minutes ago.
I'm going to continue to nerd out with Dr. Thomas Sheahen.
Go ahead.
No, right after this quick break, we'll come back with more. Here's what we know. So I want to tell you about our new sponsor, the Gym Guys. I have been working out with them for over a year now. It all started with a pandemic and there was no place to go. The gyms were closed, all that kind of stuff. I found the Gym Guys because they come to you. The commute is theirs. Isn't that one of the worst parts of working out, is you have to factor in the commute time? Not with the Gym Guys. And it's more motivating. It's one thing to say, I'm going to work out today. It's another thing if you know, like, I have Luciana coming over today at 11:15. I got to be ready for it. And then they change the workouts up for you. They give you an app, so when you're working out on your own, you know how to do it right and what you're trying to do. And they also give you access to a nutritionist. It's all there for you. You can take it as, if you're just starting your journey, or maybe you want to take your journey to the next level. They've even got a contest on how you can win 100 free sessions with your friends and coworkers. It's at thebiggestmover.com, thebiggestmover.com. But you'll find the Gym Guys on the web, GYMGUYZ. Dr. Sheahen, as we were talking about right before the break, we were talking about Jupiter and the moons. The moons, to me, it seems like that's where astrophysicists are tremendously, and astronomers are very interested, because the moon would create the gravitational shifts that would create heat within the planet. So the sun is not everything that you need to create the warmth and stuff, because stars can be tremendously unpredictable, as far as I know, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, you have this situation. A moon circling a planet does cause a gravitational pull. And the most noticeable thing on Earth that we detect from this is the tides. Tide comes in, the tide comes out, depending on how the moon moves around. If a planet doesn't have an atmosphere, then the pulling and the squeezing by the tides is not going to do a whole lot of damage to the planet. It's not going to heat it up or anything like that. Where you get heat from in most planets, coming from the very core, is the radioactive decay of some elements there. When a star blows up billions of years ago, and all of this radioactive stuff goes every which way, and another billion years go by, and it condenses and it forms planets that go around some central star someplace else. There's still that radioactive stuff in the core of these planets, and some of it comes off as heat. We get a little of that from the Earth. Not very much, but a little. And I think your moons of a planet are not going to contribute significantly to that form of heating. But if there's any kind of a liquid surface like water, it will certainly create tides. So after all, our moon is 250,000 miles away, and it's pretty tough to have much coupling other than gravitation between the moon and the Earth. And on other planets, the moon, some of them are closer, some of them farther away, but they have a pretty remote relationship to the dynamics of the planet itself.
We haven't really found, and again, it's very hard to find a planet, that's not within our solar system, much less a moon of that planet. But as far as I know, and please feel free to correct me, that we haven't found any other planets that have similar size moons to ours. As far as our moon seems to be really big for the size of our planet, doesn't it?
Well, it's kind of standard, we think, because it's the only one we know of. Yeah. If you were to find a distant star someplace, the nearest star nearby Earth, only a few million light years away, and you're successful in detecting a planet going across it, the way they detect a planet is there's a teensiest little shadow in the total light that reaches us coming from the star because there is an object traversing in front of it that has to be the moon. The planet's going around the stars. It's really tough to find these things. You've got a lot of noise in the optics, and you got to filter like crazy, and you got to average and massage the data for a long time to find a single planet around a star. Or to then ask for a moon around that planet is truly beyond reach of our technology now. We just couldn't possibly ever see it. So we're not going to find moons around planets in other solar systems. We can see the moons in our own solar system and judge their relative size and so forth, but we do not have the reach or the capability to find out anything about moons in other solar systems around those planets. We can find that the planets are there, but we can't find their moons.
Interesting stuff. Because when it comes to our moon, when you sit back and you think about how many billions of things or trillions or I don't know how many things had to happen to get us to this point where you and I get to have this conversation right now is mind-boggling. As we get back to the God conversation in science, it's mind-boggling to think that was all happenstance as far as how many things had to go right for the universe to exist, much less our planet.
Well, this is something that is causing people to realize when they look at the reality, these coincidences as they're called, that there's something behind it. There's some great intelligence. There was a great astronomer of the 20th century named Fred Hoyle. He was the biggest advocate of the steady state theory for a long time. But eventually the data reached him and he found out about things, and the data came and he said, the facts are there. I got to change my theory. And he abandoned the steady state theory in favor of the Big Bang theory, which he had opposed for many, many years. And then later on, he looked carefully at all of these important things that, as you said, have to come together and have to be just right. And he wound up saying that there's something going on here that we can't explain. And he said a common sense reading of the facts suggests beyond a shadow of a doubt that a super intelligence has monkeyed with the numbers and that there are no blind forces in nature at all. And he came to the conclusion that God created the universe, and he made his conclusion on the basis of the facts of science that could be measured. And that is what we as scientists try to do every day, is make measurements of facts. And when we get them and we try to understand them and interpret them again and again and again, the science points towards God. It won't let us get away with saying there is no God or God doesn't matter or any of this sort of stuff. And among other things, it also points to the fact that there isn't some multiverse. See, one of the excuses, if you don't want to believe in God, is to say, oh, well, our universe is just the one that got lucky because there's really universes out there. No, there aren't. You either get one universe, as we have, or you get an infinite number of them. And if you have an infinite number of them, there's all kinds of bad stuff involved there. And the only way you can believe in it is if you don't understand the meaning of the word infinity. So this is something that a lot of scientists have glossed over and been very careless in their thinking to ignore the simple, pointing reality of science that points to the fact that God created this. And what God thought up was really, really good. And there's a lot of people and scientists who fail to adequately appreciate this because they are imposing upon their image of God a whole bunch of constraints that humans have that shouldn't be imposed upon God.
The whole idea of the Big Bang causes them so many conundrums, right? Because, I mean, no matter what, you start with the question of what was before. What caused it? And that's just something that without, again, this is me as a layperson, without a creator, I don't know how you say, well, these things just magically appeared. How is that any more obtuse, if you will, or fanciful of saying a creator made it? No. I'm just gonna believe that this magically happened.
Well, this is the choices that people wind up facing, and if they recognize how absurd the choices are, then they come back to reason a little bit more and say, what's really going on here? There's a thing that goes clear back to the year about 400 A.D. to St. Augustine, who was the first to discover or realize or think, understand, that God created space and time together, and that the creation of space and time was the beginning. Therefore, there is no meaning to a question that says, what was God doing before he created the universe? Because there was no before until after God created time. But people don't realize this. A lot of people sit around wondering what God used to do before he created the universe. No, there is no before. First thing God did was create space and time. And that is something that is removed by a step from the normal idea that we have of creation. You know, people think God created the galaxies or the planets or the stars or whatever, et cetera, but the idea of the coordinate system being there is something they've taken for granted. And in my book, I explain why you shouldn't take it for granted. See space and time as God's creation, and then you will understand better what the rest of the creation of the universe is.
And that extends into eternity in your book.
Only in the forward direction. We are unable as humans to imagine how far forward time projected. But once God created time and space, then he's got a universe that is expanding, growing in space as it grows in time, and it has an unlimited horizon that we can't even comprehend. And one of the things I say in the book is be humble, accept your human limitations, don't try to tell God what to do, because we're on a much lower plane of intelligence than God is.
I saw one of the chapters was named Hell.
Okay. In the latter part of the book, I think it was called Can Hell Be Real?
Yeah, Can Hell Be Real? Yeah.
Yeah, I talk mostly, first of all, in the front part of the book, I'm not doing physics. Nobody has to do any homework problems. There's no equations, okay? But I talk about physics, and I talk about what the real world is and all that. Then in the central part of the book are some important applications, discussions of things like evolution, the Big Bang, and so forth. In the last three chapters in the back, I call that category of that class of those three chapters what I call possibilities. And a possibility is, in this book, Tom Sheahen speculation. I don't know this stuff because I'm talking about things that I haven't experienced. I haven't died yet. I don't know what the afterlife is. But what I am trying to do is at least move the needle in the direction of getting people to think. Right now, the image most people have of hell is just dreadful. It's these little red guys with spears and pointy tails running around. And that's a comic book image. You know, the church has taught for thousands of years that hell is the complete separation from God, from any intimacy with the love of God. and it goes on forever, permanently. So I propose in that chapter an image of hell, which is quite different from the pointy-tailed guys that are red, but instead is a matter of the human mind, the human spirit, the human soul, interacting or failing to interact with God in a way that is terrible, terrible end. And I hope that when people read this, it's not I hope that they will agree with me, but rather I hope that they will start thinking on their own at a higher level. Because we've got to get away from the pointy tail or red guys, That cartoon stuff leads to people dismissing the idea of hell, saying there is no such thing. The reason is there's no such thing as the comic book version, okay? But there is a real hell, and we need to think at a higher level in order to learn about it, because we're not getting there by just ordinary human images. And so all three of those latter chapters, the one on heaven, the one on hell, and the one I call are a multidimensional life beyond time, are interesting possibilities that I put on the table for people to examine and think about, but I'm really trying to encourage people to think and speculate on their own, in their own direction.
I'm going to ask just real quickly, but I don't know how you can answer real quickly, but I still want to ask it. Why is quantum mechanics so weird? Why is it when we get down to the small, things go crazy and we have things that really shouldn't exist anywhere else, but they do on quantum, when you get down to quantum mechanics? We get big, things get weird, and we get small, they get weirder.
Yeah, well, okay. You get conditions that are governed by what is called uncertainty. This is part of God's creation too, okay? You have in the universe certain laws and conditions that God thought up. He's the one who invented these laws. But when he did it, he put in a characteristic called uncertainty, which, among other things, at the human level means we have real trouble measuring both space and time at the same time in the same way, okay? But this allows particles, elementary particles like electrons, protons, and neutrons, to interact with one another in a way that is determined not absolutely, but only by probability. You can have a moon that's going to go around the Earth, and astronomers in the Mayan age calculated where the moon was going to be, and their calendar ran all the way up to the year 2012, okay? It was amazing. The Mayans did astronomy that well. But if you're talking about an electron or three that are going around an atom and how they're behaving, the uncertainty prevents you from doing any of those kind of calculations for the long term. And big objects, you get what's called classical physics. And that's because all the quantum things that are there at the very lowest level have averaged out, okay? You're flipping a coin. You don't know if it's going to come up heads or tails, right? Mm-hmm. Flip a coin 3,000 trillion kajillion times, and you know that it's going to go up with 50% probability in all cases. So the way quantum mechanics turns into classical science is in the law of big numbers. The probability that you have to deal with at the quantum level gradually gets washed out when you've averaged over incredibly big numbers. So that if you've got an air molecule, a molecule of oxygen that's drifting around the air, you haven't got any idea where it's going to be. It goes all over the place. But you can still do weather of, is there a storm coming? Because you're talking 10 to the 28th or 10 to the 26th or some gigantic number of molecules. So when you get the big numbers, then the quantum effects average out. But when you're looking very, very closely, a few at a time, you still get the effects of quantum mechanics down there. And one of the few macroscopic things, and by macroscopic, I mean big enough to find, mm-hmm. something you can hold in your hand practically, is the material of superconductivity, which is a quantum mechanical phenomena that actually is real and apparent and useful at the level that human beings can deal with. And that was my specialty when I wrote a book about 25 years ago on superconductivity. But that is one of the very few examples where quantum mechanics does continue to exist even as the numbers get really, really, really big. And so that's another one of those mind-boggling things, but it's one of the realities that we are aware of now, we take advantage of them, and make good use of. When you go and you stick your head into an MRI machine for a medical exam, you are, aside from the fact that the hospital asked you to sign a waiver of this or that or the other thing, you are depending upon superconductivity to give you the measurements that are important in studying your brain or anything else. And almost nobody, including the doctors and the nurses running the hospital, have any idea of the relevance of quantum mechanics to that particular activity.
I hope you have been able to tell how much I have enjoyed this conversation. I hope it's come through, because I have been delighted, Dr. Sheahen.
Well, I definitely have detected that for sure, and I appreciate your enthusiasm. And honestly, I encourage you to keep exploring and keep thinking and keep dreaming up new ideas yourself. And if I would say to every reader of the book, more important than what I say is what you, the reader, think and the way your mind expands. Because to answer the big questions, why are we here? What is life all about? So forth. You will not find the answer by thinking at an ordinary human level. You've got to think at a higher level. You got to reach up in your thinking in the direction of God in order to understand what it's all about. That's hard to do, but people have to do it. And I am not the guy who did it all, by no means. It takes millions of people with this kind of new thinking in order to advance our race and our civilization to a higher level. But in every case, science is going to point us towards God, and that's really, really important.
Thanks for joining us this week. If you love this episode, please subscribe, download a few more episodes, and please leave a review. Reviews really help us get this out to more people like you. Also, we'd love to hear what your favorite part was. Be sure to join us on social media to engage in even more unexpected conversations. Until next time.